Welcome to Easy Governance with SharePoint and AvePoint. In this session, we're going to look at how governing your SharePoint environment can be made easy with a policy-led approach to planning governance and with DocAve's brand new product, governance automation. The two concepts go hand in hand, and in this session, myself and Jeremy Thake want to break the concepts down and help you gain perspective on how your organization can improve the way you enforce, implement, and continuously improve your SharePoint environment. Jeremy Thake will showcase AvePoint's new product DocAve Governance Automation, which enforces and automates SharePoint governance policies. And I'll start things off by taking you through the concepts of what do we mean by a policy-led framework and how it fits together with DocAve's new technology. Jeremy is an enterprise architect with AvePoint. He's based in New York. He is an author and co-founder of NothingButSharePoint.com, a fantastic community-driven resource for covering all angles of SharePoint.
For those who don't know, I was actually based in Australia for 8 years prior to moving to AvePoint over 14 months ago now. So I am a SharePoint MVP, and I'm based out of New York, which is our headquarters. I was very honoured to actually speak at the TechEd Europe this year alongside Mark Rusinich. So I'm an avid speaker. So if you haven't seen me speak in Australia, I will actually be back for TechEd Australia later this year. You guys might have known me from my community work I do. I'm the co-founder of NothingButSharePoint.com as well. And if you do have any questions afterwards, all my contact details are at the bottom of that slide.
My name's Andrew Jolly. I'm a principal consultant with OBS, and I'm based in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. My specialist area, or the area I enjoy the most, is all things information management. I'm a bit of an out-of-the-box extremist, and you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, talking about all things SharePoint day in, day out. So in terms of what we'll cover in this session, we'll look at governance planning, one size does not fit all, how one set of governance rules doesn't cut it in a modern information environment, and why there are areas where you need to provide control and standardization, and there are other areas where you want to allow your people more freedom to do the things that they do best. We'll cover an approach, a service-led, policy-driven, technology-enabled governance approach. We'll then cover how SharePoint as a set of services, when viewed as a set of services, provides a structure for a policy-driven approach to governance. Services aid governance by clearly identifying lines of responsibility and the requisites for interacting with a specific area of your environment. We'll look at enabling technology. So we'll then take a look at how technology can play an enabling role in supporting the implementation of governance policies. Jeremy will take us through the DocAve Governance Automation, the new addition to the DocAve suite that enables governance automation of policies, approval processes, and permissions that information services require. Then we'll also just touch on support and service desk readiness, and we'll end there by taking a look at what you need to do to prepare and set yourself up for a policy-driven, technology-supported approach to governance. So what do we mean by one size does not fit all, and why do we need an alternative approach? So SharePoint can be used in so many valuable ways within an organization that a broad sweeping set of governing guidelines will be almost guaranteed to fall short of governance goals, even more so if all a governance plan does is cover only the technical aspects of keeping your SharePoint technology layer humming and backed up. SharePoint governance needs to cover what's happening on top of that application layer. Simply put, there is a need for different rules and approaches for different areas and usages of your SharePoint environment. So why is the single plan approach to governing such a problem? So the main issue here is that typically a single all-encompassing governance strategy generally tends to align to a single approach. So if we consider SharePoint as a pool of resources for your organization, we can consider the use and management of those pool of resources as a question of scarcity and abundance. So in terms of a scarcity dominant approach, the left-hand column there, this also known as the locked down approach, the risk lies in underutilization or under-realization of the potential benefits of the SharePoint platform. However, the benefits of a scarcity dominant approach is that it provides conditions for value through efficiency. That is, we're channeling people into the right uses or the appropriate uses that we want them to use the platform for. So in terms of an abundance dominant strategy, the other extreme end of the scale, known as the free-for-all approach, there is a risk of overutilization and subsequent waste. So for example, site sprawl, duplication, non-sanctioned use of the platform, permissions and groups nightmares. On the other side of the coin, the benefits of an abundance dominant strategy is that it provides conditions for innovation, allowing business groups to solve their own problems and obtain their own efficiencies for the things that they do. So the challenge is not to decide on which approach to take, but to put in place the mechanisms for being able to apply each approach to different areas and usages of your SharePoint platform. Technologies such as SharePoint enable both approaches. However, organizations are faced with the challenge of understanding when and how they should achieve that balance. It's not simple and straightforward, and when it gets tough and challenging, organizations can become fatigued. Analysis paralysis can arise, and in an effort to keep things simple, the reductionist approach will often rear its head, pulling an organization back to treating SharePoint as just another application and just wrap around it a single technically focused service level agreement. So in order to govern effectively, we need constructs that give us something to manage. We need constructs that allow us to align our company's SharePoint initiatives with the company's business initiatives, its needs and its goals. And we need constructs that provide the business something to hook into and use to support business transformations and programs of change. So this can be achieved by looking at your SharePoint environment as a collection of business-focused information services, each with defined policies and guidelines for their use. So rather than one enormous single governance plan for SharePoint, think of a collection of smaller, business-focused and business-aligned governance plans. So what does SharePoint look like if we think about it or conceptualize it as a set of services? To answer this question, let's go back to the beginning of the SharePoint governance story. Many of you may be familiar with the governance pyramid from the early 2007 days. The single plan approach that we talk about often attempts to employ or put this model at the center and use it as its basis to wrap a single strategy around it. Although the diagram is clear and simple and does a good job of framing governance in terms of level of control and purpose for sites, it's worth unwinding this model and taking a closer look. So we've recreated the diagram here so we can position the concept of the service in reference to this common model. Instead of perceiving our SharePoint environment as a single service on its own, I want you to first consider SharePoint as a platform or fabric, as you can see stretched out across the screen there. This is the idea that SharePoint as information infrastructure, an enabling platform that provides the underlying foundation for SharePoint-based information services. So with the platform concept in mind, let's position the content governance pyramid on top. Now remember, we haven't envisaged SharePoint as a set of services yet, and this is what managing SharePoint as a single entity can sort of be conceptualized as. So here we are at the bottom with our My Sites, characteristic of ad hoc, unstructured content at the bottom of the pyramid there. Then we have our short-lived project or initiative type sites in that pyramid structure. We're moving up further here. We're looking at the more permanent based sites with content that changes less often. And then up the top here, we're looking at highly organized, managed, and controlled content towards the top. So without clear differentiation and direction between the uses of SharePoint, the goals it's supporting, and the clear lines of ownership and custodianship, being able to drive, measure, and prove success or manage expectations in this kind of model is extremely unlikely and rather unruly. Really, you're looking at only probably 50 or 60 sites. So we can only imagine how that can pile up and become very unclear as time goes on. So a business information framework of services is about conceptualizing the environment as a set of business information services. In doing so, we begin to introduce constructs with which we can govern a little easier. So I've decided to carve the pyramid up into the following services. I've got a corporate communications service, I have a team workspace service, I have a projects-based service, and I've got the My Site service at the bottom for this example. So we refer to services as within the following definition. A discrete domain of control that contains a collection of tasks to achieve related goals. The objective of a service is to represent what the business does and to place a boundary which all the parties can agree on. This is in line with ITIL's own definition for a service, which states, a business service is a means of delivering value to customers by facilitating outcomes customers want to achieve. So these definitions are very business focused, and they're not technical services as we most used to talking about services as. They're more business focused explanations of what we're trying to do with our information environment. So from this point of view, what services do is, and what they bring to the table, is a top-down approach to service-oriented architecture. They're focused on what the business problem is about or what's trying to be solved, not on the how of implementation. And often they'll use and predominantly use the organizational functions or the what of the enterprise as its basis, since these tend to be relatively stable organizational constructs as opposed to traditional organizational structures that are usually highly changeable. We've all been in the situation where a department's had a rename, and that's caused a lot of flow-on effects to our information architecture and a lot of chaos when it comes to trying to reorganize things. So using functions tends to provide a more resilient information structure and model for organizing your environment. It also helps to break out of the pyramid model. So the pyramid is fine to communicate the dimensions of controlled to uncontrolled content, but it should not be confused as an architectural structure or information architecture approach. By unstacking the pyramid, it provides a different perspective to perceiving our framework of services that are situated on top of our information infrastructure. It also makes it easier for us to think about adding new business services over time. So for example, I'm going to add here a business intelligence service or hub. And then a few months later, maybe my organization's ready to introduce a communities of practice service for everybody to use and gain benefit from. It's worth pointing out here that in terms of information architecture, a service architecture is different. It's a view on the overall system. This means that your IA can change within the service model with little impact to the concepts of services themselves. Taking the graphical representation just one step further and flattening the boxes down from the slide before, we create this visual representation of our underlying SharePoint platform. 6 example services are conceptualized on top of the platform here, ready to serve the business by providing the sites and capabilities that will fulfill information management needs. So another way to think of services is as zones or areas across a landscape that have different usage rules and activities permitted within them. The resultant landscape is a network of interrelated, manageable business information services, each with goals and objectives, ownership and direction. The resulting catalogue of services here is different for each organization. So the service definition is key in formulating policies and guidelines for clear lines of ownership and operation. So there are 5 key components of a service definition. I've drawn on the service definition guidance from the OASIS Reference Architecture Foundation for Service-Oriented Architecture version 1. I'll pop this up in the last slide as well if you want to jot this down. So OASIS, if you're not aware of it, is the Organisation for the Advancement of Structured Information Standards. So it's a non-for-profit consortium that drives the development, convergence and adoption of open standards for the global information society. So OASIS promotes industry consensus and produces worldwide standards for security, cloud computing, service-oriented architecture, web services, smart grid, electronic publishing, even emergency management and other areas. So within our service we've got the concept of service description. We have service functionality. We cover service interaction, service visibility, and policies and contracts. Now I'll just step through briefly what each of these sections within a service definition are. So in a service description we have normally we're describing here what the service is for. Now this is really in business speak. This is about making sure that anyone can pick this up and understand what it's about. We might also explain who the service is for, how it aligns with the corporate goals, and the business context and environment within which the service operates and supports. And also the result of using the service, an articulation of the benefits of why this information service exists within the business. We also look at the service function. We also talk about the service functionality. Here we talk about what options and variations are available within that service, if there are any. The functionality breakdown of that to set expectations about what the service is there for and what it can do for users. Technical assumptions, things such as minimum spec requirements for people interacting with that service, is i.e., for example, Internet Explorer, is that a prerequisite are other browsers supported, for example. We then talk about, we have a section here of service interaction, and this is where we describe the behavioral model for the service. So how does someone go about having a site provisioned? What is the steps or the rules around site access, and what happens in the site decommissioning process? Many sites can have end dates or dates where they become sort of unneeded anymore. And what happens here is we want to, as much as possible, understand how to decommission that site and do something with it. And this is where we detail this here in the service interaction. Information model. This is where we would articulate to users or people within the business what makes up this service, whether it's site collections and subsites. This could be important for them to understand. Information standards that we want them to conform to, usages of content types and so on, and prescribed information management features. So, for example, a particular area such as a project space area may require the use or the conformance to using records management capability as part of operating in that service. Service visibility. This is about making sure people understand and what the service is, where they can find it, and how they need to interact with it. So we articulate here site plans and options and for people to understand. Audience-specific information, if there's a difference between one group in the business's use of this area or to another. It also is a chance for us to define the service catalog information that may feature in our sort of service catalog that we put out to the business. We also have a section finally here on policies and contracts. This is where we detail the ownership for a specific service, both business and technical. It's very important that we make that distinction between the two and that we articulate both of those in this service definition. Service agreement, if you have these within your organization, existing ones, or you may need to create them for SharePoint, or maybe you need to map the service to your existing service agreement structure. This is how you would articulate this here. You may talk about the service terms and review schedule, so how long can someone have a site within a project area perhaps, and what happens at a specific time when that site is deemed to be up for review or consideration for decommissioning, and what are the steps around maybe extending its life or closing it down. We will also, it is worth articulating here that you include support policy and procedures. Most organizations have a standard set of support policies and procedures covering most IT systems. Depending on the usage of your SharePoint environment, this may differ depending on the area in your portal, and this is where you need to be articulating those differences here. Skills and capability policies. What is the minimum level of ability or skill or prerequisite of knowledge to using this service? And this is where you would need to include things about that topic here. So it's important to remind ourselves that governance is not just a SharePoint concept or challenge. There is governance at all levels of the business, from corporate governance at the top right down to technology governance here at the bottom of this diagram. The benefit of services is that they aim to stretch right across the governance continuum. So a good service definition and the policies that make up a service are able to speak to each level of that enterprise governance continuum. Your executive and your staff should be able to pick up a service definition for a SharePoint-based, say, project delivery center and be able to understand the value it offers to the business, the accountability surrounding the service, how someone in the business can get access to the benefits it provides, and what are the protocols for using the service. So your collection of services come together to form a business information framework. So this approach recasts SharePoint as a catalogue of business-focused services, a network of services, each service having enterprise-level maturity such as ownership, service levels and support, and they are built and put together to support enterprise needs. SharePoint as a service requires more discipline than deploying it as a collection of technology parts. Services allow for organic growth, but the growth occurs within a framework and in the context of services. So the resulting catalogue is different for each organization. One of the most important aspects for the operation of SharePoint as a set of services is that of site lifecycle management. No one aspect of governance has the most impact and flow-on effect to the wider challenges of information management. Over time, sites can stack up. Many lose relevance, people come and go, business focus shifts to other priorities. Sites get old, sort of becoming the virtual equivalent of brownfield sites, abandoned or underused facilities. Without appropriate management of site lifecycle, organizations can face a number of information management and user adoption problems as this information landfill starts to build. Site provisioning is the process by which a user requests a site within a service. Site decommissioning is the process by which a site is identified as no longer being required and is up for deletion or archival. A service will include the policies by which a site is to be assessed for closure. In this case, we see that a site has been flagged for archival after 4 months since having been created. Services provide the concept of the what and the why. When it comes to how and putting into action something like site lifecycle management, organizations traditionally have used a mixture of approaches. Documents and pages on the internet to convey service offerings, forms to capture requests, manual site provisioning and workflow-based site provisioning. And complying to policies and contracts can often involve a mixture of manual and PowerShell maintenance scripts, for example, together with a disciplined schedule kept by IT staff to keep to some sort of routine. Managing SharePoint can be done this way. However, DocAve has unified much of the site lifecycle management aspects of service governance and now makes them available in a consolidated management experience. Basically, simplifying many of these ad hoc and loosely coupled activities to bring governance, to bring automation to the governance activity. I'll hand over now to Jeremy Thake, who will talk about do a little bit of a preamble to the demonstration that he'll do. He'll cover profiles and plans here and move through to his demonstration shortly.
Sure, thank you. So as Andrew's explained there, that there is a big driver here for a more of a services-based offering for your internal organisation, which today, from our perspective, has include, from an implementation perspective, a lot of custom solutions, whether it be custom lists or info path forms, etc. Sorry, Andrew, do you mind keeping up those slides for 2 seconds, just to jump through? I'm assuming that you guys have dropped off. So basically from that, what we were seeing was a big demand for customers to try and essentially provide a mechanism for automating or semi-automating a lot of these offerings and wrapping those services up that have been defined within the governance plan to allow organizations, business users, to kind of ask for a new site but with a constrained management around them. So when Andrew showed those diagrams there of the pyramids, etc., it was essentially the ability to see, with the ability for them to ask for essentially a new site or a site collection, but when they ask for it, they're basically constrained to where they're able to create it. And the same thing can be applied to not just where it's created, but what policies are put in place. So as soon as these slides quickly jump back up, I'll be able to explain in a little bit more detail what we're seeing in the field from what those service descriptions actually include. Okay, I'm not going to wait for the slides, I'm just going to jump through. So essentially what we see in the market at the moment is that not all content's treated equally. So you may have a set of site collections which are business critical, which from that scenario may have like an hour a backup scenario, and maybe quite possibly the data is extended from a blob perspective to a high performance SAN because that data needs to be responsive. But then with that data, because it is business critical, may be very, very performant. So you have this concept of it needs to be archived off in a 7-year period from a records or disposition perspective. And then from there, what you might also see is from an audit perspective, maybe from a compliance perspective, that all of that data needs to be captured and audited from a full perspective. So when a person views a document, or when he edits a document, or he checks out the document, all those activities need to be logged and then that retained from an activities perspective for maybe a 7-year period. Whereas low business critical content may only need to be backed up once a week because those service levels don't have to be as aggressive as that business critical content. And also from a storage cost perspective, it may have been agreed by the organization that these aren't stored on high performance SANs, and obviously at a lower cost of them can be stored in cloud storage such as Azure. And likewise, because this isn't business critical, there may be no mandate in place from a compliance perspective to store that information for more than a year. So that information may be disposed of after that period. And as well, significantly to that, you may not need to track all of the activities of that content. You may only need to track things like the views on that content. So on the next slide, what we see is that these kind of breakdowns of business criticality versus non-business criticality result in essentially these things being offered as different services descriptions. So Andrew, if you just skip to that next slide, essentially what we see a lot of organizations doing is offering it as a gold, a silver, or a bronze offering. So where we had the 1 hour backup, the SAN, and the 7-year archiving, and the full auditing, we now start to see the difference there of this concept of actually offering not just those things around compliance and auditing, but also extra things. So we see a lot of customers that are focused on enabling or disabling SharePoint Designer. So maybe the gold policy site collections that are created would have SharePoint Designer enabled, and maybe have a 100 gig quota. Whereas a silver policy site collection, maybe the SharePoint Designer isn't enabled and they only get a 50 gig quota. And likewise in bronze, what we start to see is a 10 gig quota as well. And what that means for the organization is when we start offering these things up, and Andrew, if you just progress to the next slide, you'll start to see that we can actually start to offer gold, silver, and bronze to different departments or different functional areas within organizations. And with that, what that means is not only can we kind of scope and constrain what people are allowed to do with the services they're offered, but we can also do things like have a chargeback model in place. So from a chargeback model perspective, what you'll actually be able to see is that maybe the HR team who can pick between maybe a gold and a silver site, they would essentially have the ability to pick maybe that gold costs them $50 a month, whereas silver may only cost them $25 a month. And they can have that offering, but by choosing the appropriate chargeback there, essentially under the hood, there is some associated SLAs provided with that. Now the business may not understand the technical details what's going on, but they can be explaining a business purpose what those different SLAs will mean. Now another key concept that comes up is this concept of accountability. So when we look at creating sites and site collections, when they're first created, people are very eager and very keen to have that content provisioned, and they may manage it for a little while. But over time, maybe they get changed to a different position, or maybe they leave the organization, and that content may become very stagnant and stale. So what we have within a lot of organizations now is a list somewhere, a register of these are all the site collections or the services that the business have requested. And here are all the business contacts that are accountable for those things. So from there, we're able to do various steps. So the first step we have is if there's a concept of a lease expiration, what we can actually do is state that once that lease has expired, we can reach out to that business contact and ask them, look, your lease has expired. You had a gold site. The lease lasts 6 months. Would you like to renew that lease? And are you aware that there's a chargeback associated with it? And then also from that concept of maybe it's not just that lease. Maybe they go, well, I don't need to renew the lease. You're right. We've had this site for 6 months. We want to actually remove it. So as this slide animates out, what you'll actually see is that we can go from managing it from an end-of-life perspective here, where the site could possibly get deleted. But we also know that business users actually, sometimes they will just click renew, and they'll just carry on to keep renewing that lease, and maybe because you don't have a chargeback model in place, there is no impact on the business user, but there is on the storage growth of your SharePoint farm. So what we also see businesses doing is looking at the inactivity of sites. So maybe that site, based on audit log activity and based on IIS activity, hasn't been used at all. So we can flag those things as well and say, look, you requested this service 6 months ago, the lease has got another 6 months which you've just renewed, but we've noticed that you don't even use this site anymore and no one's actually accessing any of the content. So we're seeing that as a very common way of being able to retire sites at the end of their life cycle. Now, most systems will have different things in place, such as the ability to change a business contact as they change over time. And as you see in this slide animate out, what you'll also see in here is things such as the ability to change the SLAs, such as moving a site from maybe being business critical from a gold perspective, maybe down to a silver perspective. And also, from an additional side to that, is this concept of changing the purpose or the classification. So essentially, when we're talking about this in detail, we're really focusing on this concept of, as Andrew was animating out those pyramids on his slide decks, managing when these things are born within the environment, but more importantly, when they're ending of life. Because it's essential that your SharePoint service doesn't grow in an uncontrollable format. So, apologies about the delay here on the slides. I'm hoping that, Andrew, if you can transfer that to me now, I will show a quick demonstration of the product. So we can get a rover. NASA can send a rover up to space to Mars, and we can see live footage of the Mars imagery, but we can't get a PowerPoint slide deck presentation to animate correctly. So I'm hoping that now, once I show my screen, that you guys will be able to see this. So Andrew, could you just let me know if you can see that on your screen? So essentially, hopefully you guys should be able to see the dashboard for governance automation. Now, to now we've really talked about kind of you guys being able to build these things yourselves. And essentially what you'll be able to do with our governance automation product, which we released in June this year, is be able to manage these things both from a business user dashboard perspective, which you're seeing here, and also from an administrator perspective. The key thing here is when a business user logs in, he'll be able to see all the things that are pertinent to him. So if he goes and looks at what he can do from a start new request, when he drives in here, he'll be able to see all the different services that are available to him. Now there is a little bit of demo data in here, but for instance, if I wanted to create a site request where I wanted to request that a new site collection be created, and maybe I'm in my HR department and I need to create a new annual leave project process here, where we're going to improve the annual leave system within our site. So I'm going to give it a quick request title, and I'm actually going to name the annual leave project site for what it's going to be created for. Now, the key thing that you'll see here is that when he when he or she picks where they want to create the site, it's scoped down in the farm. So when I select there, you'll notice I can select that, and then I need to pick what I want for the URL. And then when I click through here, you'll notice that when I select from the site templates, there's only particular site temps I've got available to me. So we can constrain in this view what sites are allowed to pick from. So maybe because I'm working in a team here and I need a candidate list and a task list, I'm going to pick those team sites. Now in this setting, we've actually enforced that it's going to use the same permissions as the parent site where it's created. But I can actually choose a navigation. So maybe you want to make this show on my top link bar. And I'm not actually going to have this show in my quick launch by default, so I'm going to say no there. And essentially what happens after this is they click save and submit, and that will kick that process off where they'll be able to see in there my request that there's an annual leave project site that's been created. Now in the background, if I go back to the home page of from an administration view, there's various different components that make up that individual request. The first thing that we need to do is essentially create a approval process. And each approval process type requires configuring in our product, because we can have not just site collections being provisioned here, we can have sites being provisioned, and we can have security being transferred also. So if I come through, and typically that's what we see. So you'll see here that in our first version, we can see that we can pick how many stages we want in our workflow. So if I just quickly entered that in there and added some data there, when we get through to the next stage, we're defining each approval workflow, and we can either at the moment specify by user or subset of users in parallel serial, or by role of being the farm admin or the manager of the person who requested that site collection. In subsequent service packs, we'll be able to make that a lot more flexible in terms of the approval process there. And also we can have the concept of configuring predefined email templates with various placeholders in there as well. So we're getting very, very flexible inside of those things, with things such as escalations on those approval processes. In future releases, we always get this question, is how we can integrate with other workflow products. We'll actually have hooks so that you can actually externalize this approval process into your own business process management tools as well. The main kind of guts of this is really in this concept of looking at the policies. So if I looked at the goal policy, for instance, what you'll be able to see in here is this concept of having maybe there's running the backup plan that's set up. So when I create that site collection inside SharePoint, it will abide to a backup plan that's been configured within our DocAve product that we have had in the marketplace for a long time now. Or that we've had from an archiving perspective, that we're going to actually archive this content off after 3 years. So if you're already using existing DocAve technology, we can actually integrate that back into there, and then when you provision the site, it will abide to these policy rules that you defined. You'll see in this instance that we actually have no quota activated with this site collection, but you may want to, as we showed in previous slides, actually highlight those things there. So this is just a real quick kind of brief run through there of this concept of having approval processes and policies that drive how your business users can make requests. So what I'm going to do is just hand back quickly to Andrew now. Hopefully that will come across fine. And Andrew can just kind of wrap up quickly and we can handle some Q&A. I apologize if those visuals were a little bit delayed as well, guys.
Okay, and with that in mind, we'll hand over now to Jeremy, and he'll take us through what governance automation from DocAve looks like in the flesh. So the last section here, just to wrap up, is around support and service desk readiness. The first step that you would need to do to get into DocAve automation of governance is to identify the services that make up your information environment. Once you've done that, you need to define policies for each service so that you understand how these things are going to be provisioned into the environment, their projected closure time frame, the ownership model, all those aspects that we've talked about earlier on in the presentation. And then finally, mapping those policies to DocAve governance automation. So OBS can support you in the service identification and definition process, now that whether that be helping with your initial discussions and connections between the business and IT, or if it's helping to size the services and conceptualize these so that they appropriately fit in with your IT service management strategy. We can also review what you've produced and provide options for direction and where to go next. We can also assist in the deployment of AvePoint and DocAve governance automation, and in helping you map your services and their policies to DocAve's governance automation capability. So thank you for that. And if you need any information, any further information, please don't hesitate to contact either myself at OBS or Jeremy at AvePoint. The details are there on screen. We'll leave them there for a little bit. I've also included the reference to the service definition terminology and model that I was using earlier on in the presentation, just at the bottom there. And thank you very much for sitting in and watching this webinar. We hope to have you watch some more soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks everyone for listening as well. Thanks, mate.